Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today. We are here talking about World Press Freedom 2025. As we're watching journalists, particularly Palestinian journalists, they are being targeted, they are being killed. And more of our so called legacy media journalists are leaving corporate media, and they're striking out on their own because they have stories to tell. But we're going to have to go back a little bit. We have to go back a little bit. We have to look at the Vietnam War. Many people have credited Walter Cronkite with turning the tide of the war. They said that when he went in and saw what was happening, he changed everything. Well, Jeff Cohen from Roots Action, co-founder of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, said not so fast. And I'm so glad I have a faculty member, a very dear friend of mine. She's at the Medill School of Journalism. Thank you very much at Northwestern University. She's the director of the Solutions Journalism Department. We're so excited that Deborah Douglas is with us today. Let's get right to it, because you know what? Deborah Douglas has me looking at things in another way. And you take me through the looking glass. You always make me say, I feel like I'm with my parents. You say, not so fast. Wait a minute. Hold on. This is the Guardian's headline. Oh, no. And I'm going to put my glasses on for this.
Okay.
Yes, I lived long enough to need these. Oh, yeah. But you can't miss it. It's an opinion piece, and it says that the U.S. left Vietnam 50 years ago today, but the media still hasn't learned its lesson. The last helicopter, you wrote, lift off from the roof of the American Embassy in Saigon on the 30th of April, 1975, marked the end of the Vietnam War. 50 years later, mythology about the U.S. media coverage of the war is locked into the faulty premise that news outlets were pivotal in causing Americans to turn against it. Some do say that the mainstream media, they undermine this noble war effort. And you make the point that Americans still cannot wrap their minds around losing this war, the great superpower, to these poor little people.
Yeah.
They walked in and, they walked into someone else's country and acted like they do it better than anyone else. And
that's right. And I was just in Vietnam last month. Norman's column in the Guardian yesterday, and the articles we've written at FAIR for years have shown this. There's many myths about the Vietnam War, and one of the biggest myths is that it was mainstream media that turned the public against the war. It's actually got things backward. It was the public that was protesting, having teach-ins, turning on to progressive and independent media, marching in the streets. Martin Luther King Jr. read an independent radical magazine, Ramparts, and he saw the photographs of the kids and the others who were maimed and killed by napalm in Vietnam, and that got him the final straw where he had to speak out against the war in April '67. The reality is that most of the mainstream media was cheerleading for the war. It's what Walter Cronkite did in 64, 65, 66, 67. It wasn't until 500,000 U.S. troops were in Vietnam, occupying a peasant country that could not have harmed us if they wanted to, and they didn't. And it wasn't until then, February of 1968, 500,000 troops, that Walter Cronkite said the war is a stalemate. The only way out is negotiation. But prior to that, he'd been trying to convince people that it was a noble effort, that it was for democracy. The reality is that independent media and young people turning on to independent media and progressive media, and then having teach-ins on campuses and organizing, in spite of the propaganda from the mainstream media that it was a noble war, that it was a war for democracy. It was the independent media and the activism and the organizing that turned the public against the war. I could give you one statistic. In February 1968, again, 500,000 U.S. troops are already in Vietnam. The Boston Globe did a survey of 39 leading newspapers in our country at a time when half of the country said this was a mistake, it shouldn't have happened, we shouldn't have troops. Not one of the major dailies was editorializing for the withdrawal of troops. That was a position of millions and millions of people, but they were unrepresented in mainstream discourse, in mainstream media. And you'll remember when Martin Luther King Jr. came out against the war in April of 67. Again, it was after he saw something not in the mainstream. He saw these incredible photos of napalm victims in Vietnam, civilian victims of the US war, and he spoke out. And the New York Times denounced him for it. And the Washington Post denounced Martin Luther King Jr. And Life magazine wrote of Martin Luther King's speech at the Riverside Church on April 4, 67, called Beyond Vietnam. Life magazine said it was demagogic slander that could have been scripted by Radio Hanoi, Hanoi being the capital of North Vietnam. So it's upside down. The mainstream media was very slow in telling the truth about the war, but it was a good lesson. And Norman Solomon's piece in The Guardian makes this point, and we've made it at FAIR for years. It's a good lesson on why people need independent media, why people need activism, why people, when they learn things that maybe aren't emphasized in the mainstream media, they need to spread it to everyone they know. That's the lesson of the war. Obviously, it helped that Muhammad Ali spoke out against the war. Dr. Benjamin Spock, the pediatrician, Martin Luther King Jr., Stokely Carmichael, there were a whole bunch of people, but they weren't getting their news from the New York Times. Mm-hmm. They were getting their news elsewhere. So that's what I think is the lesson of the Vietnam War. We need independent media. We need independent voices like Santita Jackson. That's what we need, because mainstream think tank to this day usually accepts that the U.S. is a benign force in the world, it's trying to do good in the world, it's trying to bring democracy and human rights to the world. It's not true now. It wasn't true during the Vietnam War.
But you also talk about the Pentagon's narrative and how, because it carries over to today. Before I bring you in, Deborah. Mm-hmm. Because we're seeing we didn't learn the lessons because we're doing this all over again. Look at all the journalists who are being killed in Gaza.
Yeah.
Look at what's happening to journalists who speak truth in the United States. We cannot be silent about that. Or silenced. You can't talk about Yemen. You can't talk about Sudan. You can't talk about what's happening in South Africa. You can't talk about any of it.
Right. I think that's an important point, that, there is a war going on against independent journalism. It's in our country. It's in many countries. The U.S., as listeners of your show and viewers of your show know, the U.S. has enabled the Gaza massacre, which has taken the lives of so many journalists. It's unprecedented. The Committee for Protection of Journalists, the Committee to Protect Journalists, has said in no other war have so many journalists and media workers been killed as in Gaza. So, we haven't learned the lesson of militarism. You have this new regime in Washington that wants to cut everything except the Pentagon. And as we had this debate because Hegseth and Waltz, they included a reporter on their signal group when they're planning to attack Yemen. They killed a bunch of civilians in Yemen. That's not in the mainstream media. Yes, it was silly and crazy and stupid that they would invite a journalist when they're discussing war plans. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is who gets killed by U.S. bombs. It's usually people of color. Lately, it's been Muslims. It's just, we've had this fetish for military intervention. Vietnam War was horrific, but it continues to this day. and the U.S. mainstream media, with some exceptions, generally agrees that, well, the U.S. is working for democracy, the U.S. is working for human rights. No, that's not what U.S. foreign policy has been doing for the most part in the last 50 years.
Well, they sell that, but do they really believe that?
I think a lot of people believed it. I think I'm from Detroit, and in 1971, the Vietnam veterans against the war all came to Detroit to hold hearings about the atrocities they'd witnessed, the racism behind the war, all the names that they called Vietnamese. They had one hearing after another. They were hoping the mainstream media would cover it. But all of those, I was there as a 17-year-old activist. I was not a Vietnam vet, but I learned from these Vietnam vets that they largely blamed the media, the mainstream media, for convincing them to go to Vietnam. I mean, some of them were drafted against their will, but some of them thought they were involved in a noble cause because they heard about the U.S. is about democracy. We're standing up for the Vietnamese people and all the subterfuge. And a lot of the Vietnam vets who had gone there and seen it was not a noble cause. It was not about human rights or democracy. It was heavily about racism and othering the Vietnamese. And they turned against the war, and they came back and educated. The Vietnam vets against the war played a bigger role in turning the public against the war than did the mainstream media. And the mainstream media, by the way, basically boycotted these amazing hearings at the beginning of 1971 that really was so educational for me to witness as a 17-year-old kid. And I was sort of a volunteer helping these vets. But I remember something, it turned me into a media critic. It was so rare that any mainstream press covered this amazing series of hearings. It went on for 3 days in a hotel in Detroit, Michigan in 71. At one point, a TV crew actually did show up, and they're filming it. And this is back in the old days where you'd have to have a sound man and a lot of lights, and it was really a noisy thing. They came there for about 30 minutes, 45 minutes. And during some really emotional testimony, these veterans were pouring their hearts out about what they'd witnessed, what crimes they'd taken part in. And during a really emotional part, this camera crew just starts noisily taking down its equipment, leaving the room. And I saw a room full of Vietnam vets jeering and booing the mainstream media. So I mean, that was the day I think I really became a media critic.
So when you see that happen, and you see how disconnected, well, not the American public do not trust corporate media overwhelmingly today. And now the biggest network is YouTube.
Yeah.
I mean, relatively speaking, no one's really watching cable news.
Yeah.
Or the so-called legacy media. You're just not watching it. I mean, now even MSNBC is being decoupled from NBC because NBC is like, we can't afford this. This is a drag. You're not bringing enough money. You're bringing no eyeballs.
Yeah.
Is it really shocking?
Yeah, I got to say, when the U.S. was when the media were helping to lead our country to war in Vietnam, I wish there was this much skepticism. It took a period of years for people to realize they couldn't trust mainstream media when it came to Vietnam. Now we have slightly different factors. You've got a president who's convinced people that anything negative about him, whether it's in independent media or mainstream media, it has to be a lie. It's fake news. I mean, you've got a third of the public that they just believe everything this guy says. And, most presidents lie. No one's lied as much as Trump, but he's been able to convince a third of the country, if you see anything negative about Donald Trump, it must be fake. So you've got a lot of different reasons today why people don't trust mainstream media. Some of them good, some of them very, very bad.
Madam faculty member, Northwestern University. I only have uh, Mr. Cohen with us for a few more minutes, but what are you taking at? I mean, because this is someone who really has mentored those of us who are in the media. I have, quite frankly, I'm from a family that's been on the receiving end of the lens.
Yes.
But what we did do in the civil rights movement was, and you know this, Jeff Cohen, you had media education. Because what you would have to do is teach people to discern what they were watching in the news. And we taught them to write letters to the editor at the time and to be very engaged, because many of us didn't even know that. To show you how this works, when my brother was in prep school, and all my brothers I'm the only one who didn't go to prep school. But what was interesting was we were coming out of Atlanta after the Democratic Convention in 1984. No, excuse me, out of San Francisco, Democratic Convention in 1984. We get the word that they were assailing Vanessa Williams. They're trying to make her to resign as Miss America. So, my brother immediately, as a gentleman, defends her honor. If it's true that these photos exist, it's more exploitation of women. And of course, this is Jesse Jackson Jr. His father just finished this historic run. His letter to the editor is front and center in the Washington Post. Now, my brother was about 17, 18. But you know what they had taught them at St. Albans? As a matter of course, when they were in middle school, they were taught to write letters to the editor. You engage the media. And we have got to do that today, because you got a Pat Tillman who went to war. He left his NFL career and he was so disgusted by what he saw, Deborah, that he was on his way back home, and he was killed under questionable circumstances, let's just say. And his brother was in a car, in a Jeep that was following him as he's watching his brother get killed. He was coming home to meet with Dr. Noam Chomsky. He said, wow, we're over here on the wrong Vietnam. We're in Iraq. This is the wrong mission. I left my career, and he didn't even care about the NFL at that point. He was like, I left this, and we Americans have been misled. Help me, Deborah. I mean, how are we supposed to wend our way through this?
Well, first of all, I'm heartened by Jeff's historical deep dive and the emphasis on the fact that media literacy, being critical of media, and being organized and being active makes a difference. Because just before I was on this call, I was in another call, and we were talking about how to narrate this particular moment. Because as you pointed out, various points of irresponsibility in the 60s and 70s, what we're witnessing right now is the failure to narrate a coup and to definitively express that we are indeed in the midst of a constitutional crisis. And so much of the day-to-day coverage, it seems like more of the same. It sounds really anemic and milquetoast, much like Charles Schumer's statement that he wrote a very strongly worded letter to the White House, which is nothing. And I'm actually in the process of looking for this data point. And Jeff, you may know it off the top of your head, but there's a data point that shows that you get to a certain percentage of people organizing and speaking out and protesting, and you can shift the tide of the conversation on things. But right now, it is correct that we're laboring under a spirit of fear because every 15 minutes, something else happens. And it's so unprecedented. It is so catastrophic that I think a lot of people are paralyzed, including those of us who work in the media. To the point of independent media, Jeff, I would just point to just fast forward to the current landscape right now, where, yes, we have the big voice and footprint of cable news and legacy television news, but we also have traditional or legacy print media. And then we have a burgeoning a nonprofit news landscape that's really working mightily to fill the gap in the civic information infrastructure, because bolstering that gap, filling in that gap, putting in that information safety net is really the only thing that can save us in a time when we're faced with the growth of news deserts, right?
Yeah.
Small scale media operations that, even when they have funding to build capacity, will only ever scale so far. I'm actually having a conference at the end of June to have a big conversation about what it looks like to develop a media model, a news ecosystem that is truly sustainable, so we get access to this vital information. Because it's not a matter of just, wanting to seek out information. We need to have credible access to information. And the focus of World Press Freedom Day this year is AI. In addition to the journalists who are being killed in wars, it's AI. So in addition to the misinformation and disinformation that's being pushed out by the likes of the White House and that ilk, we're like outclassed by nuclear powered worth of AI that's being pushed out into the world that is designed to keep us confused. I was at the Global Summit in Iceland in November, and I was listening to Maria Ressa at Rappler talk about the fact that there would be more nuclear power plants built to handle the heavy load of AI, and so much of that information is going to be deployed outside of our best interest. So right now, people who work at universities are supposed to have answers, but a lot of times you have a lot of questions. And my question right now is, how do we gird ourselves against the onslaught of such powerful machines designed to keep us confused and scared?
That's for you, Jeff Cohen.
Yeah, well, it's so important that you brought that up. The controversy in Memphis today, where Musk, to power the AI, they have more turbines, and they've been distorting how many turbines. And there's no doubt, we know if there are new nuclear plants to power AI to further confuse us, we know what neighborhoods they will be located in. They will not be in gated communities. Mm-hmm. I mean, everything in our society is about class or caste, and it's getting worse and worse. I mean, when we saw the billionaires who control the internet and control big AI, big tech and big AI, beaming from the front row of the Trump inauguration, you had to shudder that this marriage of big media, big tech, big AI, and the president of the United States, who couldn't tell the truth if his life depended on it, you realize we're in deep trouble. I agree with you. There's so many news deserts. Nonprofit outlets are really important. You've got some great ones in Chicago. I mean, the Better Government Association. There's something called Block. You've got the Invisible
Chicago, yeah.
Right. Invisible Institute.
We have Borderless Magazine.
That's right. And I mean, I started an award named after I.F. Izzy Stone called the Izzy Award for Independent Media. And we keep giving the award to groups in Chicago. I mean, you have these great nonprofits. And unfortunately, the nonprofits are underfunded. A lot of them rely on foundation funding. And the foundations are so busy now with basic service and saving democracy that a lot of the media that need foundation support are not getting it.
Well, I will have to tell you, with regard to that, there is a massive movement called Press Forward that is releasing a lot of capacity building funds into the local news ecosystem, largely deployed for those outlets. Of course, it's a finite amount of money, right? And we're always looking for the longer term answer, but I don't want to leave people feeling hopeless, and to let them feel like philanthropy is not paying attention, because they are. But also, the government has a role in supporting a sustainable local news ecosystem, because really it's at the grassroots level. We got to lift from the bottom, right? The government has a role to play. And so there are several states that are making investments in like creating tax breaks and things like that to support local news. California is invested through their investment. They planted several newsrooms. Illinois is invested. I think there's some activity going on in New Jersey. There's a lot going on. There's a lot can be done. We can have a bigger and more robust conversation if we decide that this is something that we value, if we really value the truth. Or if we can come to an agreement that if we don't value the same things, that we don't want to be hurt by what's happening. Because eventually, that's the problem with racism. It hurts us all.
Well, and all of these isms, whenever you minimize anyone, my mother often says, she says it every day, you can't hurt me without hurting yourself. Before you go, Jeff Cohen, because this is when we're watching the White House reset the landscape in terms of who they allow into the press room, right? But, in this wonderful opinion piece, and it really is, it's not just an opinion piece, it's an historical overview, because I don't want to sell what Norman Solomon wrote short. I really don't. An opinion, no, it's not an opinion. This is fact-based, and it is giving you an historical overview of what has happened with the press. The point is made that, particularly when it comes to the Pentagon, the media, and I would say about everything, they become stenographers.
Yeah.
Whatever we're told. I have had the honor, I will say that, because it's nice to be invited and it's nice to learn. I've gone to the White House Correspondents' Dinner on numerous occasions. And I always felt that it was bizarre, because I said, wait a minute, we're not supposed to be hugged up with each other like this. But this is, these people sit on big stories on people that could change all of our lives. But you can bet soup to nuts that the people who they're going to kill, if you will, are the people who speak truth to power. Yeah. Who decide to take on the empire. If you are one with the empire, you get good press. Yeah. If you fight it, the stenographers come after you. Yeah. I think, you bring up the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Shouldn't they be having more than dinners? Where's the solidarity when the White House says they're banning Associated Press because they didn't jump to what the president wanted them to jump and start rewriting the map? It's stunning to me how little solidarity there is among the elite press corps. I can remember in other countries when a Spanish journalist had been killed, I think in the Iraq War, and Spain's government had joined the Iraq War. And when the prime minister wasn't telling the truth, I remember seeing video of all of the journalists at a press conference with the leader of the country. They all turned their backs to defend one of them who had died. That kind of, where's the solidarity when Associated Press gets banned from the, it's stunning.
I think what's happening, and I'm not defending what's happening in the White House press room, but I do hear reporters repeat the questions that go unanswered.
Yeah, that's gotten better. There's no doubt that's gotten better, but it's still inadequate. I watched the press conference today with Stephen Miller. And, he's a little bit like Goebbels. He's like a propagandist for fascism.
Yeah, you can't be a little bit like Goebbels. You just
that is a contradiction.
But he really does. He does give you that feeling.
Yeah, he just spews. He hates minorities. He hates migrants. He just spews hatred. Trump sometimes will make jokes about it. This guy's just spewing. And I was stunned by how bad the questioning was. He was saying things that were just blatantly false.
Yeah.
And what you've got it, he referred to the 4-year Biden depression, word for word, the 4-year, why didn't the next questioner say, you've said so many things that are false, including the 4-year Biden depression. Everyone knows there was not a 4-year depression. You said, it was like, I think, Deborah, what you're hinting at is there's this normalization
Yes.
of, it's just timid, it's sort of tepid. We're pretending like this stuff is normal. It's not normal. I want to make one more point about Vietnam, and then we could come back to, one of the ways that people that defend the mainstream media in Vietnam, they say, yeah, but the media, they exposed the My Lai massacre of these hundreds of civilians in Vietnam. Actually, the My Lai massacre is an example of how the mainstream media covered things up. People may not realize it, but the massacre happened in March of 1968. Within a few months, because of some brave Vietnam veterans like Ron Ridenour, they had photos and they had witnesses, and they were taking it to the biggest news outlets in our country. Mm-hmm. Life magazine, Look magazine. No one would touch the story. It did not come out until Seymour Hersh, the investigative journalist, with a tiny independent outlet called Dispatch News Service that they set up. That was November 69. 20 months had passed from the massacre to it finally getting to the mainstream media because the independent Dispatch News broke the story. Then Life magazine had the photos of all of the women and children that had been massacred. But think about it, 20 months of delaying this story. If it had come out a few months after the massacre happened, the U.S. Army and the Marine Corps would not have loosened their rules of engagement. There wouldn't have been as many free fire zones. We had perhaps 2 to 3 million people killed in the Vietnam War, Vietnamese. And many of them were killed during this period where the mainstream media was sitting on the My Lai massacre. And that's mentioned in Norman's column in The Guardian. Mm-hmm. At FAIR, we've been talking about it. Obviously, we're fans of Seymour Hersh, who's broken story after story for decades. But, you need a democracy requires an aggressive, independent journalism. And we just, I think I'm agreeing with Deborah on so much of it just seems tepid and normal. And that's not the period we're in.
Some of it has to do with the fact that a lot of trusted media organizations, like I have a New York Times subscription, take an institutionalist perspective. So we need to understand the point of entry that people are bringing to the lens of coverage.
But Deborah, that's what we're trying to explain here, because many people don't even realize that they're taking that in. And that is something, maybe because I come from the civil rights movement where when I was a little girl, I'm just a little bit older than you, just a tinge. One of the top 10 shows on television, you remember this, Jeff Cohen, was the FBI. Now, in my household, that show was awful because we knew who J. Edgar Hoover was. And everyone who came from the movement, and mind you, the movement had some establishment people. Dr. King was the outlaw group. I'm from the outlaw group. The people who were way out that they killed Dr. King. And then as Dr. King was killed, they smeared Reverend.
Yep.
Which you would not have anyone else who would have that kind of influence on people. That's where you get all these nasty rumors about Reverend from. I mean, even Judge Joe Brown said that. They said, no, I think Reverend Jackson was a threat. Therefore, they had to smear him coming out of Memphis. Reverend had to leave Memphis because unlike Dr. King's other cohorts, Dr. King hired Reverend because he was such a great organizer in Chicago. We already had a Saturday morning meeting where you had hundreds of people showing up every week. So the people from Chicago called Jeff and said, you got to get back here. It's awful what has happened in Memphis, but you got to come here and help calm down Chicago. The city's burning.
Yeah.
And all I'm trying to say is, wait a minute. Many of us don't even realize what we're reading every day and what we're seeing every day. I look at C-SPAN in the morning because I love Washington Journal because Jeff Cohen and Deborah Douglas, I want to hear what the people say when they open up the phone lines. But I see how they cut people off when they go a little bit too far off the
Yeah.
reservation, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, wait a minute. Because I subscribe to the Post, Washington Post, excuse me, and the New York Times and all of that. But I also go to everything. But first thing I'm looking at fair, and I'm not saying that because you're here, but I want to see, okay, now what did I miss? Because I know you all going to give me another piece of this. Most Americans, I realize they don't have the time, but many of them don't have the inclination because there's still a part of us that wants to believe that these anchors and these people are so polished and upright that they're telling us the truth.
Yeah. Well, I think the three of us have the time, and it's our jobs to read the New York Times and the Washington Post and the independent media. Most working people don't have the time. So I'm so glad you brought up the FBI show because it was sheer propaganda and people bought it. Millions of people watched it. And the FBI it was an institution that was undermining every civil rights group, every peace group, every progressive group. And yet you had this show that was taking reality and turning it upside down, where the FBI was your protector and all the great things it was doing for society. So yeah, propaganda is a powerful thing, and we need media literacy. We should be teaching media literacy from elementary school. We should be teaching people how to discern what's true and what's not. And it should begin, in my view, with TV commercials. That's such a good way of teaching people, or just commercials. That most kids are seeing commercials on the web, not on TV. But you've heard all the statistics about how young women feel about their bodies because they've seen 50,000 commercials by the time they're 20. I mean, that's what we need in elementary school. There's a lot of propaganda in society. Some of it's news, most of it is selling us products, and kids should be equipped to see through it and figure out what's fact and fiction. And I know from my experience in classrooms that students love to talk about media and to try to analyze media. It really gets discussions happening. But there was a movement for media literacy that was really strong a decade or two ago, and it seemed to wither. And instead, we've got like a president who's convinced a third of the people just believe him, don't believe journalism. And these are people that needed media literacy in the schools to be able to see through the lies they're getting from the administration. But yeah, I'm so glad you brought up FBI. It's sort of been a pet peeve of mine.
Well, yeah, I mean, because the CIA's all over Hollywood.
Yeah.
We don't realize how heavily propagandized we are every single day, Jeff Cohen, Deborah Douglas. We have no idea. And it is so real, and it's shaping our unreality.
Yeah.
So we don't even know where we are in the world.
And Deborah, who's a little younger than us, is warning us about AI.
No!
The propaganda impact of AI is going to be exponentially worse.
I can't even write a text without AI correcting me.
Yeah. They're telling you what to say. All right, I've got to tune out.
Sending you so much love, but I love you so much.
Yeah, it's so great to be with you, Santita. Great to meet you, Deborah. I love solution journalism. It's crucial. All right. Bye-bye.
I'm going to connect the two of you because you should know her.
Yes.
Sending you much love. Thank you. Deborah Douglas.
Yes.
What about AI? Because many of us, it's like it's just crept upon us, and it is here, and it is everywhere. It's in my phone. I got a new phone finally. And it's a couple of generations behind because it changes every 5 months, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, wait a minute, hold on. I know what I meant. I meant to put the ellipses here. I'm trying to emphasize something. You're trying to jam me. I have to write this text 3 or 4 times. I don't even know what's going to get sent through the air.
Right.
But I mean, really, because I can write it. I don't know what they put through. Yeah, y'all, I'm that paranoid. Okay. Olga, my cousin. Yes, it's so sad. And Bab, I love you, my sweet. I can't wait for you to come to Chicago and we are going to do something. He's one of my original morning stars. But
Mhm.
talk to me. Number one, what is AI? What is it?
Oh, wow. I wasn't prepared for that question, but I'll explain it to you the best I can. It is collections of large language models, information, language models that are put into computers that can process quickly to access the body of knowledges that exist in the world to generate information for us and to help us think. And
Wait a minute. You said something really big. I don't want people to miss it. To help us think
think and process.
and process. No, that's Deborah. No, I got about 7 or 8 minutes left here, and I know that's a big question, but you're a big person. You can help us with this because you just said something really, really big. Help us process and think, because it seems to me that it's shaping how we think, how we process information, what we decide to throw out, what we decide to keep in.
Yeah. Well, just like, I don't know if you remember the first couple phases of the internet development, and some people raised some questions about the kind of information that would be generated from search, right?
Yeah.
Early on, if you went to Google and you typed in black girl, you would get some really raw, rank kind of words and imagery back. It did not represent black girls in a respectful way
Yeah.
at all, right? And because that has to do with the input that feeds the output, the way that human beings act in the real world, the attitudes and values and beliefs just get put into the machine. And so the same exists for these large language models that they use to power AI. I actually worked with an academic, Layla Sakura, who's at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who wrote something called a feminist AI manifesto, because she wants, the powers that be to take seriously the gendered language, the gendered manifestations of this so-called AI output into consideration when we program these large language models to go inside the machine. And you could point that out for every marginalized group that hasn't been framed or treated fairly as we've developed technology, like with the search for black girls on the internet through search engines, for example. And so that's what's happening right now. Some of the early outputs with imagery from AI that I saw a couple years ago is that it didn't even, if you asked it to generate like an image, it didn't even generate people of color. It would just show white people. We know that, that's not true of the world. Or, and then we do other crazy things like put 7 fingers on a hand or something like that. But that speaks to the amount of information that it has, because it's constantly learning to get more data to generate more truthful answers in words and imagery. But also that still goes to the value system that is put into the machine. So when technology overlords say, trust us, we got this, I wouldn't. And I think that we can demand a better. We're not going to stop this. We're not going to stop the development of this technology, but we can press it into the service of our needs, right? And we can develop policies around it and organize and to advocate for policies that produce accurate results, fair results, so it doesn't do that weird, scary shaping that you alluded to earlier.
But what about what? Because it's already down the street, and technology is way ahead of where we are morally. I think just forget the laws. I mean, we're not in sync yet. And
Right.
should I say we need to be? I don't think we should be in sync with technology. I think we need to be ahead of it so we can determine how technology is to be used and how it's not to be used. As you are really academically and actually I think in your life's work, because I've known you a long time, relatively speaking, because you haven't been living that long, right? Solutions journalism.
Mhm.
What is that? Because I
Okay.
think like this whole conversation, as we in the last 5 minutes or so begin to wrap this up,
Mhm.
I want you to get us from what we've been talking about to solutions journalism, as I at least on some broad cursory level understand it.
Yeah, I'm
What
glad you
is it?
asked that question because anytime you engage with anything that's happening in the public conversation today or responding to the news, it can leave you feeling hopeless. It can leave you feeling like you don't have agency. It can leave you feeling like you don't have any dignity. And so, solutions journalism is actually a framework for covering responses to pressing social problems. So much of journalism, and we've heard a big critique of journalism today, so much of journalism focuses on what's wrong. But what if we flipped it and we asked what's right, right?
Mhm.
What if we asked what's working or what could work? Because out of all of the challenges that we face in our everyday lives through our systems, there are very likely people who know about those issues, are experiencing those issues and those challenges, and people working to address those issues and challenges. So solutions journalism encourages people, journalists and storytellers, invites them to go the next step beyond just framing the problem. Because when you just bring a problem to people, to a person or a community over and over and over again, then you get tuned out. And you talked about the lack of trust that people have in media. First of all, that's worldwide. That's not just in the
Oh
States.
yeah.
There's a trust issue across the globe. And it creates a phenomenon called news avoidance, where people either avoid certain topics or they just avoid using information altogether. So while that we do have bad actors in our system who are pushing out lies, who are pushing out misinformation and disinformation, there are things that we can do as narrators of our lived experiences, right? To tell a fuller, richer story that actually interplays with the human psychology better. It takes the story from the problem to the next step to looking at how the problem is being addressed. Now, does that mean that we're always going to report on the ultimate solution? No. But if you have an issue, say, I don't know, community-based crime, and you write or film about a slice of a response and then another slice and another slice and another slice, you have a whole body of work showing all of this activity that people and institutions are engaging in to address these challenges. And that's a different kind of relationship to news and information. And it also is an opportunity to put everyday people in the center of that story as experts on their own lived experience, right? To tell us, the world, their experience of challenging the things that vex us all or vex some communities, right? That's a different kind of relationship. We want to bring people back to the center of the circle and to be in a united, cohesive experience of upstanding or supporting credible news and information that has the context, that has proportionality, that has the voices and the authenticity that we know matters.
Well, that means it sounds to me like you're including everybody or as many people as you can into the telling of the story, shaping the narrative.
The missing
Right?
piece of the inclusion puzzle. Thank you.
No, really, because I mean that's why with us media education, just when I was growing up, that was always so important
Mhm.
because you got a chance to what I remember Doug Williams all week long. You kept hearing that John Elway was going to cream him in the Super Bowl. This was 1987, 88. Oh my goodness. Even though Doug Williams was one of the top college quarterbacks of all time. He came out of Coach Eddie Robinson, the legendary coach from Southern University. I mean, come on. And he was one of the best that he had ever seen. One of the best college football players ever produced. Mind you, came out of an HBCU, but he was Doug Williams, a legend. And those of us who came really out of the Black experience, reading Ebony and Jet, we knew that Doug Williams was great. But this was still a time when Black quarterbacks were still trying to break through.
Mhm.
They had made more progress because you had Warren Moon, but James Harris, 10 years or so before, was still new and all of that. And Joe Gilliam had just been almost destroyed by the system. But that week came, you kept hearing about John Elway. Yeah, Doug Williams, great, but feel so sad for the Washington team. I don't call that name because they're really going to lose because John Elway, you can't touch him. Honey, I had a Super Bowl party at my little apartment because I was in college then. 4 touchdowns in the side of the first quarter. Doug Williams threw. The commentators had no words for it. They were like, well, John Elway's coming back after the first touchdown. Second one, he's coming back. Third one, he's coming back. Fourth one, they were like, well, what is going on? They had to completely change that narrative. Wow. So I got my friends on the phone because my father had a mobile phone, but it was a brick then. Had my friends get on the phone and we were calling, burning up the phone line. Call this television station, tell them they need to be fair.
Right.
And I promise you, I think, and after a point, they wouldn't take any more calls. We can change things. We can change things because by halftime, when it was clear that there was no coming back, they had changed their narrative, and I think that we all had something to do with that. The last word belongs to you.
Well, it's World Press Freedom Day, right? Or it's on its way, and we normally look outward at what's wrong with the rest of the world and what's wrong with the globe. We need to be focused on press freedom at home, and that's being committed to media literacy, being discerning about the information that you consume, to actually look for credible sources of information and make it a part of your diet, and actually pay for media because what you put in is what you get out.
Deborah Douglas, Northwestern University. My girl, we love you and follow you, and thank you very much for being with us today. I love you, everybody. God bless you. World Press Freedom Day, everybody. We need the press. We need them to be free, and you need to support them. Support Deborah Douglas. Check her out. I love everybody. God bless you. Peace and love. I'm Santita Jackson, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Love you. Love you, girl. I'm going to run out of here.
Absolutely.
My parents called me 50 times.
Okay. Give them my love.